Four factors of group success in the Revolutionary War. The four factors of group success that explains why Britain won the French and Indian War also helps explain who won the Revolutionary War. Again, the four factors are capability, leadership, resources, and motivation. The advantages and disadvantages of the British and the 13 colonies at the beginning of the Revolutionary War are spoken about in this video. Let's start with capability. Britain. The British Army had two main advantages in capability at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. First, the British Army and Navy had the best weapons. The guns and cannons were usually much better than those of the colonists. Second, the British Army and Navy were well trained and disciplined. That training and discipline helped the British Army and Navy win many battles. The only disadvantage the British Army had in capability was their lack of training in wilderness fighting. The 13 colonies. The only advantage the colonists had in capability at the beginning of the Revolutionary War was that they were better at wilderness fighting than the British soldiers. The 13 colonies had two main disadvantages in capability at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. First, General Washington found that the Continental Army soldiers did not have much military discipline. The colonial soldiers were not accustomed to following orders and were poorly trained in military tactics. Many soldiers even deserted during battles. They would fight for a short time and then quit and go back home to plant or harvest crops. Second, the quality of weapons used by the people fighting for the 13 colonies was poorer than those used by the British. Because the colonists were expected to supply their own weapons, many of the guns used by the colonists were much older than those used by the British. The Navy for the 13 colonies was also poorly equipped. Their Continental Navy had no large warships, only smaller ships that had been converted from trade ships to warships. British advantage in capability means that the British right now have the lead. But now let's take a look at the leadership. For Britain's main advantage in leadership at the beginning of the Revolutionary War was that its generals had military training and traditional fighting tactics. Remember that Britain had already engaged in multiple wars at this point, so their leaders had a lot of experience. Although they often did not use effective tactics, British generals used their traditional battle tactics very wisely. They often defeated George Washington and the Continental Army anytime that the battles on both sides used traditional battle tactics. However, Britain also had some disadvantages in leadership at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. First, the British generals did not always use the best military strategies when fighting against the colonists because they underestimated them. They did not believe the colonists really would fight for their independence. Second, most British military leaders did not know what to do when the colonists used wilderness fighting tactics, and that caused their armies to have many casualties. The 13 colonies' leadership was primarily George Washington as the commander-in-chief. And even though he had experience fighting in the French and Indian War, he had very little experience being commander-in-chief and didn't really know a lot about military strategy and battle tactics. And the same went for his commanders. They were very good soldiers, but they didn't have much experience as leaders. That means that the British are the ones who had the advantage in leadership as well. Let's continue by looking at the resources. When we look at the resources, we can see that Britain had a larger army and navy, but many of them were other places in the world because Britain had a lot of colonies all over the world, not just in North America. And they also had a lot of army left in Britain to help defend them against other countries like France. And Britain had a lot of money, but they had trouble getting supplies to their army all the way in North America because it was 2,000 miles away across an ocean. So they had a lot of resources. It just wasn't always in the right spot at the right time. In comparison, the 13 colonies had very few supplies. They had very little money, and they had a much smaller army and navy. And the resources, because of that, made it so that even when George Washington was able to get enough soldiers to fight battles, they didn't always have the supplies that they needed. For example, they didn't all have uniforms. They would just kind of wear whatever clothes they had brought with them to battle. Also, they might not have had enough gunpowder, bullets, cannons, or even medical supplies to attend to those people who got injured during fighting. So that means that the British had an advantage when it came to resources as well. Now, motivation, you would think that the colonists would finally have a little advantage over motivation, but let's look at it closer as to the beginning of the war. When we talk about Britain, the government of Britain really wanted to keep the colonies because they were making money from the colonies, and they had already fought a couple of different wars to keep the colonies, so we know that that's important to them. The British people, however, were sick of wars. They didn't want to fight another war so soon, which made it really difficult for Britain to get new troops to send because the British people were sick of wars and they didn't want to engage in it. So instead, British used their amount of money to hire people called mercenaries to fight in the British army. Oftentimes, those mercenaries were from Germany. They were called Haitians, and they would really just work for pay. So their motivation wasn't for Britain to win. The motivation was they wanted money, and they would work for whoever paid them. The colonists had motivation because they were fighting on their own turf. They wanted to protect their homes, their lands, their families. They wanted to keep their businesses. And yet, 1/3 of the men that were of age to go to war actually decided not to join the fight. And they did this for a couple of reasons. Some of them had religious reasons, like the Quakers, who believed in peaceful exchanges. Some of them couldn't leave their farms for money reasons. They needed to be able to continue working to support their family. And others supported the British. Yeah, there were many colonists, I'm going to say some that didn't really care who won, and then there were others who really wanted the British to continue winning. And those who supported the British were called Tories or loyalists. And they were called Tories or loyalists as kind of a derogatory term. And these colonists that supported the British would often get punished by other colonists. Some would get beat up, some would get killed, and most of the loyalists actually ended up running away, either to Canada or back to Britain, which hurt the British army because the British army was hoping that the loyalists would join their side and fight against the other colonists, but they didn't. Instead, they just ran. So when you look at motivation, even though the colonists were fighting for their own home and family, because only 2/3 of them actually fought, the advantage went to no one. No one had an advantage in motivation. Let's just do a quick summary so we can see where we stand at the beginning of the Revolutionary War based on the 4 factors. A British victory was predicted by the 4 factors at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So if we just look at the beginning of the war, the British should win. Because in capability, the British Army and the Navy were better trained and had better weapons. In leadership, the British generals knew military strategies and tactics. They had a lot of experience. In resources, Britain had a large army and navy. They had a lot of money and they could buy supplies. And in motivation, neither side had the advantage. So once again, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, it looked like Britain was going to win.